Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, we'll be looking at the first major battle fought by the British Expeditionary Force on the Western Front, the Battle of Mons, fought on the 23rd of August 1914. We'll discuss the nature of the British Expeditionary Force at this time, how it found itself at Mons, and explore the gruelling campaign that will become known as the Great Retreat.
So here we are, Spencer, back again, episode number 2 in this brand new series. So really looking forward to this episode. Today's subject is one that you and I know both have a particular interest in. So going to be really exciting to go through the story of the Battle of Mons and quite a lot of the stuff around it. I know we've said early on that we're going to cover battles, and that is broadly the intent. But at the same time, we don't want to be kind of put into a lane where we can't explore a little bit either side of that and around some of the key issues that came about as a result of Mons and some of the other battles we'll cover in this series. So just give us a quick overview in terms of how we even get to Mons in the first place. I suppose the best thing to do is start at the beginning.
That's absolutely true. When we're doing any history project, start as far back as you can and build your way up. And for Britain and the First World War, this starts on the 1st of August 1914, when Germany invades Belgium. Belgium's a neutral state. It's not part of any of the alliance blocs in Europe. In fact, it's trusted to its neutrality to protect it from either French or German aggression. It's rejected any attempt to bring it into an alliance bloc for this reason. But the Germans actually invade Belgium as a way of outflanking the French defences on the Franco-German border. They're going to use it to hook around behind those armies on the Franco-German border and encircle them and destroy them in this incredibly ambitious invasion that's known as the Schlieffen Plan, after its architect, Count von Schlieffen. Schlieffen's dead by 1914, but his plan lives on, and it's an attempt by the Germans to crush the French in 6 weeks. It's that invasion that triggers Britain's involvement in the war, though not immediately, of course, because Britain doesn't declare war until the 4th of August, and it declares war because Germany has violated Belgian neutrality. Britain is a guarantor of Belgian neutrality, although strangely enough, so is Germany, actually. And on the 4th of August, Britain, seeing there's a real threat here, there's a threat that the Germans are going to capture the Belgian Channel ports, they're going to break into France, they're possibly going to defeat France in rapid succession, Britain declares war. It's already made pre-war arrangements with the French that in the event of German aggression, it will at least suggest it's going to come to France's aid. There's no formal agreement, but that's the reason why the British Army is deployed, or to be pretty its proper term, the British Expeditionary Force, about 120,000 men stationed in Britain who are going to be mobilised on the 4th of August, and they're going to be moved out by sea across the English Channel to join the French army in the coming weeks.
So we touched on this a little bit earlier. In fact, in the last episode, we touched on this when we looked at ages of combatant soldiers, and particularly 1914 is interesting because when we look at the kind of troops involved, at least from a British perspective in 1914, it will come as no great surprise that the majority, or at least a large proportion, are pre-war professional soldiers. As the late great Richard Holmes once said, these are men who shoot for their pay. And they were fairly straightforward in that. These are guys who have decided to join up pre-war, and they're going to embark on a life and a career of soldiering. And therefore the quality is very high, and I'm sure we'll come back to that shortly. But we should also mention as well that there's a huge disparity in numbers at this time. The BEF and the British Army as a whole is significantly smaller than most of the major key players in Europe. And as a result of that, they're going to have to proverbially be looking in their pockets for the loose change that's lying around. That might be other regulars stationed out in different parts of the British Empire, which of course is huge in 1914. It might be reservists who go out to replace those regulars so the regulars can come back. There's also territorials going to get thrown into the mix, but not quite in time for the Battle of Mons. So professionals and reservists are going to be doing the bulk of the fighting here at Mons, and they bring their own different kind of feel with them, don't they? Some of these guys are combat experienced, others are militarily experienced but not necessarily in combat. And how do they stack up, Spence, against the Germans on the other side of the line?
Really interesting question, because the army of 1914, the British army, is really unique. You've already mentioned it's small. To put that into context, it's actually smaller than the Belgian army in 1914. The Belgians deploy about 150,000 men. The British deploy about 120,000 men. So it's a slightly smaller. But it, as you've alluded to, it makes up for its small size with its quality, because the British army is the only all-volunteer army of the major powers of Europe. All of the major powers rely on a form of conscription and compulsory national service. So in Germany, for example, you serve 2 years of army duty before you're allowed to back into civilian life. In the British Army, everybody is a volunteer, and some of these men have made a lifetime as a soldier in the army. Others have joined because they're hard up. Life's hard. There's actually a phrase that's still in circulation in 1914. It's the army or the workhouse. At least the army pays you a wage, gives you a meal, allows you to have some clothes and a roof over your head. And if you're in desperate need of something and you're a fit young man, it's a way out of trouble. It's an army that recruits overwhelmingly from the poorest of society from its common soldiers, but is led by a much more aristocratic officer class. And yet, for the soldiers who join the army and make it their career, there's a real sense of pride in being a member of this army, that your skills are at a high pitch, you're highly trained. Man for man, the British Army is the best trained army in Europe in 1914. It benefits from long training periods. Uniquely amongst the armies in Europe, it's got a lot of combat experience in colonial warfare. Give you a little flavour of that, of the battalion colonels who take their battalions out in 1914. There's about 157 battalion colonels in the army in 1914. 138 of them have been under fire somewhere, so they've seen action, they know what it's like to fight. But there's also this other layer of soldiers in the BF of 40, and that's the reservists. These are men who've served previously as full-time soldiers. They've then left the army for whatever reason, but they've chosen to stay in the reserve, and they're paid a small wage for that. They have to attend some training each year to keep their rifle skills up. But some of these men are quite old. They're in their 30s by now. They've raised families, they've had other careers. And although their military skills return pretty quickly, they're highly trained, they don't forget how to handle and load a rifle, for example, their fitness isn't the same level as a regular soldier. They're not used to hard marching. But don't think that these reservists are incompetent or are a problem. Some of the best writing, actually, about the 1914 campaigns by reservists, and I think especially of Frank Richards' Old Soldiers Never Die, a terrific memoir from a reservist who was as tough as nails, and he and his fellow reservists were as tough as nails. Frank Richards reckoned he could deliver 20 aimed shots a minute from his bolt-action Lee Enfield, even as a reservist. So it gives you some idea about how well-trained he was, even though he perhaps wasn't as fit as he'd been in his serving days. So even the reservists have got good military skills, but they weren't as fit and as body-hardened as their regular comrades. But overall, the BEF was the best trained army in Europe. But of course, it was very small in number.
Yeah, and talking about being fit and body hardened, there's a bit of a story that goes on here in August of 1914 at the top of the tree, because actually some of the senior officers going out there probably wouldn't necessarily have fallen into that category, would they?
No, it's absolutely true. So the three top men at the head of the British Army, at least one of them is pretty body hardened, and that's First Corps Commander Douglas Haig, and he's cavalryman, experienced cavalryman. He's fought well in South Africa in the Boer War. He's in charge of Aldershot Command when the war breaks out, and he just transitions that command into First Corps, consisting of 1st and 2nd Divisions. He's pretty hard and tough, prides himself on his fitness. But his comrades in 1914 in high command aren't quite to the same level. So the overall commander of the British Army is a man called John French, another former cavalryman, dashing cavalryman of the Boer War. But by the time 1914 rolls around, he's the wrong side of 60. And even though he's quite a Lothario, his affairs are the stuff of legend in the army, he's certainly not very fit. And actually, before 1914, he takes up bicycling as a way to try and secretly lose weight. Doesn't actually tell anybody that he's doing this, but he's definitely carrying some weight. But nobody's carrying more weight than Second Corps Commander, a man called James Grierson, who it boasts, in fact, of the many battles he's fought with a knife and fork. And by modern standards, we'd probably say he's not just overweight, he's obese. He's an enormous man, and his subordinates, his staff officers, are actually issued with penknives so that they can open veins on his neck when he's getting a headache or his head swelling or anything like that to try and relieve the pressure. That's the science of 1914. And unfortunately, he's going to have meet a sticky end as a result of this serious weight problem. Because on the route, actually in France, he's heading towards Mons on a train. It's blisteringly hot, stressful. Everyone's moving around. There's a lot going on. And Grierson, his heart, which has been working double time for years, pushing this bulk around, it has enough. It gives out. He has a heart attack on the train that's carrying him towards Mons, and he drops dead, which is not really how you want to start your campaign in a major war in Europe.
No, absolutely not ideal, we might say. But it does open the door for perhaps one of the most legendary characters, certainly of the late Victorian period, and perhaps you could argue up to about 1915 or so, because he's replaced, in fact, by Horace Lockwood Smith Dorrien. One of the legends, one of my favourite characters in military history. This is a man who started his career in 1879 at the Battle of Isandlwana. Well, I say battle, more correctly, you could probably say the massacre of Isandlwana, where an entire battalion of the 24th Foot in effect gets surrounded and wiped out by a huge Zulu force numbering some 20,000. And Smith Dorrien is one of the very few white men to actually escape the battlefield that day. He's on a huge, long, and very deadly retreat down something called the Fugitives Trail, and he managed to escape by jumping into water from a ravine, and he ends up getting dragged across the Buffalo River, hanging on to the tail of a horse. This is the same man who in 1914 comes out as a Corps commander and is going to take over 2nd Corps. So he is going to be right in the thick of the fighting for a good proportion of the Battle of Mons. Now, it's worth saying, he's not exactly the most agreeable character in British military history.
No, he's not. His temper is legendary in the British Army. He's rumoured to have the worst temper of anybody in the entire British Army, and there are some big personalities who have very intense tempers in this army. And Smith Dorrien has the worst of the lot. It's said to be like a volcano. You never know when it's going to erupt. And the only person apparently who can calm him down is his wife, who likes to put her hand on his wrist and simply say, Horace, which calms him down. But if he turns that fury on you, you know about it. He's a man of distinct opinions. He's quite willing to argue with his superiors. He's very independently minded. And crucially, he is the sworn and bitter enemy of the overall commander, John French. They've fallen out with each other sometime around 1906 to 1908, and the exact causes, well, we may never know. The standard line is they fell out, they disagreed over tactics. Two very strong-willed men argued with each other. They didn't reconcile. Me personally, the depth of their hatred, especially French's hatred towards Smith Dorrien, knowing that French was an absolute Lothario, I just wonder if there was a woman involved. I can't prove it, but I've always suspected this, and maybe that John French had his eyes on Lady Smith Dorrien, who was a very beautiful woman of her day, was rebuffed, or Smith Dorrien got involved. We can only speculate, but regardless, French and Smith Dorrien absolutely cannot stand each other, and now they're going to have to work together, and they've only got a few days to forge a working relationship because the campaign is underway.
That's right, and the campaign is going to start off fairly quickly as well, with the BEF arriving and mustering in and around Arras, concentrating their forces, the French town, before they head north, and they're going to be moving up towards Mons. Remember, we've got this huge Schlieffen plan, which is now coming down, descending in effect from the north in a number of scythe-like sweeps, and they're going to make their way down to the south, with the British moving up alongside the French, trying to stay roughly in line with them, and they're going to make their way up and stop in and around Mons. Now, Mons itself I quite like it, I have to say. The town square is quite nice. It wasn't exactly the truth in 1914. There aren't many veteran accounts that talk of Mons as being a beautiful place. It's a pretty industrial town. It's made up of a number of small little villages, lots of coal mining activity going on. There's a major canal that runs through it. That's why it's there in the first place. It's a nice place today if you go to the town centre and don't explore too much around the area. But in 1914, nobody was really sending postcards home from Mons. That being said, it's a key location to go to. And there's a good reason why they go there. In fact, French is looking fairly optimistically at this point, isn't he? He thinks that there might be a chance to go on the offensive.
That's right. He fancies his chances. And this is partially because information is pretty hard to come by. There's news that the Germans are in Belgium. They forced the Belgians out of their border fortifications at Liège. The Belgian army's retreated to Antwerp. Brussels, the capital, has fallen. It's indefensible. Germans have captured it. But the general impression the Allies have is that there's relatively small German forces that have done this, and that the main German armies are still on the Franco-German border. In fact, as the British advance, the chief of intelligence for the cavalry division, a man called George Burrow, he comes up with a really innovative way of assessing where the Germans are. He gets a telephone directory of all the Belgian railway stations, and he starts phoning them. And if there's an answer in German, he knows that railway station must be under German control. And so he starts plotting roughly where the Germans are. At the same time, British cavalry is starting to go out and encounter Germans. And British aircraft from the Royal Flying Corps are starting to spot big columns coming towards the British. But it's still very unclear about how strong German forces are in front of the British. And John French thinks they're pretty light. He's got ambitions to go over the canal in Mons, advance towards Brussels, push the Germans all the way out, and maybe even link up with the Belgians in Antwerp. And as more and more reports arrive saying there's a lot of material coming our way, French largely dismisses them. He thinks they're overwrought, he thinks they're over-exaggerated. He's confident. He really wants to take the fight to the enemy.
Yeah, and of course he learns fairly quickly that that's not going to be possible. And courtesy, as we said, of the Royal Flying Corps and some pretty impressive local intelligence and scouting work done, particularly by the 5th Dragoon Guards. There's a great story there. You can always pick that one up in our YouTube video called The Battle of Mons over on the Battle Guide channel. But the main thing is Mons does need to be held, at least for a period of 24 hours. This has been agreed because the French off to the right flank are also holding, and the hope is to blunt the Schlieffen Plan, or at the very least delay it significantly. It's worth pointing out, Spence, that the Schlieffen Plan here is based all on time. Everything is to do with speed and breaking through either the British or the French before the Russians way out to the east can mobilise.
That's right. The Schlieffen Plan's got an extremely strict timetable. Everything has to be done quickly and according to this plan. There's very little flexibility in the Schlieffen Plan. The Germans actually wondered about what might happen if the British arrived to interfere with the Schlieffen Plan prior to the war, but they dismissed this. They didn't think the British would arrive. And if they did, they thought the British army's so small, it's just going to be swept away. We're going to destroy it with ease. But there is this time pressure, and the Germans advancing through Belgium can't wait around. They need to just blast through any opposition they encounter. And the main opposition is going to be the BEF and also French Fifth Army, which, as you said, is to their right. About 30 to 35 miles distant, actually, quite a way away. There's a bit of a gap between these two armies because the British and the French don't cooperate very well during this advance. John French, despite his name, doesn't speak French very well. And the commander of Fifth Army is a man called Charles Lanrezac, who is a very intelligent military academic, if you will, but also just an incredibly difficult man and a bit of a depressive man as well. He spends most of the campaign in August 1914 telling everybody that I told you this would happen and now look what's happening, until eventually gets sacked in September. But this means the British army is in some ways out on a limb at Mons. It's holding that position. It's actually been asked to hold that position by Lanrezac and the French because they're under very heavy pressure. And Lanrezac doesn't want the Germans getting onto his flank. He needs the British to hold the line there. And Sir John French agrees to do this. The idea is hold at Mons for 24 hours, use the canal as a defensive position, delay the Germans, and then what? Well, John French probably thinks that this is all overblown and he can advance again. But what he doesn't know is there's an absolute German steamroller coming towards him. And despite the Royal Flying Corps giving away that there's these huge columns, I'm not sure John French takes it entirely seriously. But in fact, he's about to be hit by the main sickle arm of the Schlieffen Plan.
Yeah, no doubt it's going to get messy. And for those of you guys that haven't been to the battlefield, it's perhaps worth trying to just understand briefly, albeit through audio, how exactly the battlefield looked. So, as Spencer says, the idea is to anchor British defence on the Mons-Condé Canal, which runs way over from the west in a pretty straight line until it gets to the area just north of Mons, around the little village of Nimy. And at Nimy, it takes a decided curve, which means it creates what becomes known as the Nimy salient. And it's here, of course, the idea of a salient. Those of you guys that will understand the Ypres salient, the idea is you can be attacked on multiple sides. And so this is going to be the real danger point here. And there are 2 battalions that have been given the job of holding the Nimy salient. And they're really going to be the kind of heroes of the Battle of Mons, at least from a British perspective, Spencer.
That's right. So the 4th Royal Fusiliers are defending on the left. They're defending the Nimy Bridge itself. and the 4th Middlesex are on the right, and they're defending the bridge at Oberg train station. So each battalion about 1,000 men strong. They're going to be anchoring the British defence on the right, and they're going to be faced by a real oncoming German sledgehammer, because swinging down towards them are Alexander von Kluck's First Army, which is the main hammer, if you will, of the Schlieffen Plan. It's the outermost sickle of the Schlieffen Plan. It's got the furthest to go. And by some reckoning, it's probably the best army the Germans actually have, with some of its finest units. Germans don't really know what's lying in front of them. They know that there's some British troops about, because British and German cavalry have been skirmishing. But because of that real time pressure, the Germans have to move fast. They're not going to be delayed by this. They think there's probably a rear guard or a screening force on the canal, and they advance to attack without really carrying out much reconnaissance. And that's going to lead them into trouble on the 23rd of August. It's a misty morning. Been very hot up until this point, but in the mornings are often misty when it's cooler. It's misty, it's confusing. German forces begin to arrive initially at Oberg on the rightmost part of the British line, come through the mist. They can't really see much on the other side of the canal. There's actually accounts from the British side. They can see German officers stood near the canal with field glasses, looking out, trying to find something. But the British are well concealed in the buildings and the gardens near the towpath in this position. They lay low, they wait, and it's only when the Germans try and advance across the bridge that they give them hell, to put it bluntly. They open fire on these troops as they come across, and that's when the battle really begins.
Yeah, it starts off on the right-hand side, and it kind of, you imagine having a kind of ripple effect to a certain extent. So it starts off on the right, and then it's going to work its way down towards Nimy and the famous rail bridge, which is going to be occupied and defended by the men of the 4th Battalion Royal Fusiliers. It's worth pointing out at this time, despite the battalion being 1,000 men, in 1914, the battalion only carries 2 machine guns. Those machine guns are going to form the backbone of any defensive action, and they're going to be, rather unsurprisingly, based around the 2 bridges, the one covered by each of those 2 units, and they are going to play a significant part in the action to come. In fact, the fighting at Oberg, it's, in my mind at least, there's a little bit of a kind of end of the Napoleonic nostalgia era to it, because there are accounts of German troops marching in close order straight up and attempting to cross the bridge and getting hit by machine gun fire. Or was it machine gun fire? This opens one of the controversies and the myths of the Battle of Mons.
It does. So we've mentioned before, the British Army is very well trained in 1914, and really the pinnacle of its training is its musketry and its marksmanship training. British Army is has the best trained marksman of any army in Europe. The ammunition allowance for a British soldier in 1914 is 250 live rounds of ammunition a year. That's small by modern standards, but it's huge by the standards of 1914. And the pinnacle of musketry training in the British Army is an exercise called the Mad Minute, where you will be required to fire 15 aimed rounds at a target 300 yards distant in 60 seconds. And you can only start with 5 rounds in your rifle, so you're going to have to load 2 more clips during this operation. You need to score at least 12 hits to qualify, and if you score more, you can actually earn coveted marksmanship badges. And that's really important in the Army of 1914 because they come with extra pay. And this echoes Richard Holmes' comment about these were the men who fought for pay and they shot for their pay as well. And so the Army's very well trained in musketry, can deliver a huge volume of fire very rapidly. And there's a legend that appears very quickly in the accounts of this battle, and it's reiterated in the British official history that's produced in the 1920s, that German troops mistake this absolute hail of rifle fire for machine gun bullets. So fast can the British fire their rifles, Germans can't distinguish that they're only 2 machine guns. They think there's loads of machine guns at Oberg and at Nimy. But actually finding proof of this is extremely difficult. People have spent years searching for a German account that actually says this about Mons. Doesn't seem to be one. There's some anecdotal evidence, but it's rather hazy. In fact, in my opinion, if the Germans believe they were under machine gun fire, it's because they were at Mons. They were being hit by the machine guns of the Middlesex and the Royal Fusiliers, which were being served extremely well, especially by the 4th Royal Fusiliers, who would use their machine guns as the absolute anchor of their defence at Nimy Bridge. And this leads to one of the most intense and heroic actions on the British side of the entire Battle of Mons.
Yeah, I mean, we can't talk Mons, can we, without talking about 2 main characters. And that is going to be Lieutenant Dease and Private Godley. two men who are in the machine gun section. One of them, of course, commanding the machine gun section of the 4th Royal Fusiliers. And they are going to be manning the two guns, which have been dug into the bank. So on the Mons side of the Mons Condé Canal, and they're going to be looking over the rail bridge. Bear in mind, there are a number of bridges that have been blown up along the canal. This is one of them that hasn't been blown. And so it's going to be prime real estate, particularly when it comes to bringing guns across, which is what the Germans are hoping to do to continue their advance. And you've got Godley and you've got Diess, who are manning these two machine guns, and for more than an hour they hold off staggering German numbers. All of the men, almost all of the men, being wounded or killed at their guns. In fact, Diess himself is wounded 4 times before finally a 5th shot hits and kills him, and he dies slumped over his gun in almost a boy's own late Victorian kind of story. But that's not the end of it, because Sidney Godley, who interestingly I think, Spencer, is not one of the most proficient gunners in Diess's platoon, is he?
No, he's not. According to Diess's own records, his own writings before the First World War, Godley is the least proficient in technical terms gunner he's got in his section. But anything he lacked in technical skills or technical know-how or precision of numbers and this sort of thing, he makes up for in sheer blood and guts. Because with Diess dead, the 4th Royal Fusiliers actually withdrawing. They need covering fire. They don't want the Germans to just rush this bridge. They're starting to fall back, moving their wounded back if they can. They need a volunteer to hold that position. And Godley, the last man standing at the machine gun, maintains his fire. He's badly wounded too. There's a shell that bursts behind him. A piece of shrapnel flies into his back, gives him a very severe wound in his back that he's losing a lot of blood from. He keeps fighting, though, until eventually he runs out of bullets. He's used every single round in the machine gun. And then by his own account, he actually picks up the machine gun and throws it into the canal. The Germans, however, actually find the machine gun actually in the position, and the German reports say he didn't throw the entire machine gun into the canal. That's some going. It weighs about 60 pounds, and he's severely wounded. He tears the firing pins out and throws those in the canal, which as good as disables it. You can't fire a machine gun without a firing pin. So he's disabled his gun. He actually starts retreating back, but he's lost so much blood. He's so exhausted. He must have been in agony. He collapses. He's tended to by Belgian civilians initially, and then he's captured by the Germans, who do offer him medical aid. But his heroism and Diess's heroism has held off the Germans at a critical time. It's allowed the Fusiliers to fall back to their next defensive position, and it's greatly delayed the Germans getting across the bridge. And for this reason, they're both rightly awarded the Victoria Cross, the first Victoria Crosses won by any soldier of the British Army in the First World War.
And since we're talking about these kind of personal acts of heroism, it's worth saying that there is no monopoly from the British side on heroism that day. In fact, there's a German character that I think we could do well to remember, and his name's Oscar Niemeyer. And it's about the same time that Godley and Diess are performing their actions of incredible heroism at the rail bridge. About 600 yards away, there's a swing bridge, which is a kind of old-fashioned bridge that's can be opened or closed mid-canal in order to allow traffic or boats to pass. So this has been opened just before the battle, meaning it's sitting in the middle of the canal, basically unusable. And in fact, it's Oscar Niemeyer, this young fusilier in the German service. He has managed to swim across the canal under intense rifle fire, make it to the British side, and then start winding the handle which closes the bridge. He's doing this under incredible fire, and just at the moment of success, as the bridge clicks into place, Niemeyer is shot and killed. What it does do, though, is it allows the Germans to cross at yet another point, and so this further causes the British basically need to fall back now through Mons. But Niemeyer is killed and is also, I think, powerfully buried in the same cemetery as Lieutenant Diess. He didn't receive the Iron Cross, which would have been the highest award available to him at that time, because it simply wasn't available posthumously. But I'd argue he's richly deserved it.
I think that's absolutely right. It's really important to remember that there is heroism on both sides. And for those of you who might be visiting Mons in the future, when you go to the San Symphorium Cemetery, it's really worth noticing that Diess and Niemeyer are buried almost within sight of each other. Two heroes obviously fighting on very different sides of the conflict, but just gives you some idea about individual bravery at this battle and intense fighting, of course, all along the length of the canal. Because one point just to make is, though we focused on this critical area of the right flank, the battle rages further west as well, with the Germans trying to push in, get across the canal, in some cases succeeding, in other cases being stopped on the bridges. But really, it's that right flank being driven into the town of Mons itself, which changes the nature of the battle. Germans get across the canal, drive the 4th Middlesex and 4th Royal Fusiliers back, suffering heavy losses in the process. But that starts to compromise the British flank, and the battle starts to degenerate into really bitter urban fighting. And something we're apt to forget is this is the first time in British Army history it's had an urban battle in an industrial town. All its previous experience has been in either colonial wars, which are fought, of course, in a variety of environments, or going even further back into the Napoleonic Wars in pre-industrial towns. So it's the first modern urban battle the British Army fights. And urban fighting is very ugly, it's very confused. Mons catches fire, both sides get intermingled, it's difficult to work out what's happening. And by about 7:30, 8 p.m, sun's starting to go down, both sides are tired, the Germans are tired and confused, they're sounding ceasefire, they're having friendly fire incidents in places, and the battle sort of comes to an end by mutual agreement almost, both sides tired, and both sides locked together as well in the town of Mons. And that's going to pose problems for how the British Army extracts itself from this position.
Yeah, for sure. It's going to be really tricky, and we'll come on to the assault at Landrecies, or the rearguard action at Landrecies briefly. But it's worth just reminding ourselves that the British Army is split into 2 corps at this time. You've got Douglas Haig's 1st Corps, who are slightly off to the east, and then you've got Smith-Dorrien's 2nd Corps, who've been doing the bulk of the fighting in and around Mons. To their south is a large forest called the Forêt de Mormal, and this is going to be absolutely key to defender and attacker alike, because in essence, there's only one good road, a dead straight Roman road that runs down the western edge of the forest, which is going to allow the Brits to withdraw south in something like speed, comfort, and order. The problem is it can't fit both corps, and so Haig's corps, so far unengaged, is going to move around via a load of small village roads to the east, and these 2 corps are going to split. And the Germans, at least at first, are not going to realise this has happened. But just before we get to that, Spence, just a quick segue, because I think it's always important to put the kind of broader context in whilst we're here. You know, Battle of Mons is rightly well remembered in British circles. What we shouldn't forget, though, is that the French, about this same time, are fighting on an astronomically larger scale.
That's absolutely right. So the day before Mons, 22nd of August 1914, is sometimes given the shorthand for the French of the Battle of the Frontiers. Now, this isn't a single battle. Sometimes people think it's a single battle. It's not. It's actually a series of battles that rage right from the Charleroi in Belgium. That's where French 5th Army, about 30 miles away from the BEF, is, right down the length of the Franco-German border. It's not a single battle. It's a series of battles, extremely bloody, on the 22nd of August. And across that entire battlefront, the French are said to have suffered some 27,000 killed. Not killed and wounded, killed. And this is actually more than the British suffer on the first day of the Somme, killed. So it gives you some idea of this scale. So if 27,000 are killed, we can probably triple that for wounded as well. You're looking at over a staggering sort of figure on a single day. By comparison, British casualties at the Battle of Mons on the 23rd are about 1,600, of whom several hundred are actually captured. They've been wounded, they've been left behind, the British can't move them, the Germans capture them. So the day before, the French could well have suffered over 100,000 casualties in a single day of fighting, and then the next day the British suffer 1,600. So in scale terms, it's very small, and it's worth remembering the enormous Franco-German battles that are going on elsewhere. But as we'll see later in the podcast, Mons has an enormous effect in Britain beyond what happens in the battlefield. But that's getting a bit ahead of ourselves. I think we should go back to, how's the British Army going to escape from the fact it's now entangled with the Germans in the burning town of Mons?
Yeah, for sure. And it's worth remembering that even though the numbers themselves, as far as the British are concerned, aren't so high, the stakes are incredibly high. What they're going to have to do is one of the most difficult things in terms of either modern or even at the time military maneuvers, and they're going to have to disengage from a larger force and manage to buy themselves some breathing space so that they can get back down, in one case down towards Le Cateau and the second down towards Landrecies. This is, of course, either side of the Forêt de Mormal. And this is where cavalry is going to come into its own. Not as a screening force as it's been in the first place, but rather as a defensive force. And Spence, I know this is something that you find particularly interesting.
That's absolutely right. So just to add some emphasis to this, the British are disengaging from the Germans. They're retreating. They've split, as you've described. And they've also become separated from the French. French Fifth Army is the nearest Allied force. It's about 35 miles distant now. So the British are really on their own, and they're being absorbed. Imagine a giant octopus starting to reach its tentacles around both flanks of the British army, because German First Army is much bigger, can expand out, it can start feeling for the flanks. And on the 24th of August, as the army starts to fall back from Mons and starts to retreat, as you've described, German First Army flings out a tentacle, if you will, on the right, on its own right, on the British left, and it's looking to hook into the British left and cut off that retreat from Mons. And the British throw out a rear guard that actually consists of a mixture of infantry, cavalry, and artillery, and they fight at a series of fields, actually. It's largely unchanged for those who wish to visit it, called Audregny. It's a really bitter rearguard action where two British battalions face off against possibly a division's worth of German troops. The British are supported by two cavalry squadrons as well. And in the midst of all this, in the confusion, in the fighting, in the heat, in the dust and the smoke, the British actually launch a cavalry charge, the first really large-scale cavalry charge of the entire First World War. But it actually goes horribly wrong and miscarries almost completely.
Yeah, it's one of those great stories. I wish we had time to go into this in super detail at the moment, but it's worth pointing out the key character, and we'll talk about it when we reach Saint-Quentin, which is really the end of this portion of the withdrawal, is an officer who manages to get himself run over by his own machine gun section and then gets bundled away from the attack in a staff car. We'll pick up that story as we get to the end of this episode, but it's worth bearing in mind it's small actions like this, including, sadly, the loss of an entire battalion who gets surrounded when a message doesn't get through to them and gets taken prisoner, but they do buy time. It's a little bit 1940 in that way. It's small penny packet rearguard actions which buy time and allow the BEF to get on the road, remember, in blazing heat as well, and start making their way south. They're eventually going to try and make it down towards Saint-Quentin, which is a town to the south, back in France, not in Belgium anymore. But the important thing is they're buying a little bit of time. Smith-Dorrien has done the bulk of the fighting, has been given the dead straight Roman road, which is much easier to travel down. The one thing he's absolutely desperate to avoid is being caught on the road by the vanguard of the German army. If he has to fight and deploy off that road, it's going to be a disaster. And if the BEF lose half of their force, i.e. one of the two corps, they may as well go home because it's going to be absolutely devastating to the Brits. Now, that's not what happens though. The BEF do buy a little bit of breathing space, and it leads us to Le Cateau.
Yes, it does. So the sacrifice at Audregny, it's the first Cheshires who ultimately get cut off, fight to the bitter end and are overrun, captured. Almost the entire battalion's lost, but they delay the German hook. They fend off the German flank attack, allow Smith-Dorrien and the rest of Second Corps to rocket down the Roman road as best they can. Grueling marching on the 25th. The pace is absolutely excruciating. Some battalions cover a blistering 30 miles on the 25th. Remember those reservists who've rejoined the army? That's absolutely punishing on these men who aren't used to hard marching. And it's compounded by the fact all the returning reservists have been issued with new army boots when they arrive. So they're trying to break in these hard leather boots in tropical August heat on paved or cobbled French roads being pursued by the Germans. And a significant number of reservists just physically cannot keep up. Their feet are warm, bloody. There's accounts of British soldiers taking their boots off and wearing them around their neck. They'd rather march barefoot than actually go through the agonies of breaking in these boots. So it's grueling stuff. And on the 25th, the Second Corps under Smith-Dorrien reaches the small town of Le Cateau. And the orders he's given are to continue the retreat the next day, move off as soon as he can, with the hope of rejoining Douglas Haig's First Corps, which is actually on the other side of the Forêt de Mormal. But Douglas Haig has got problems of his own. He's actually being attacked on the evening as Smith-Dorrien is beginning to make his plans to withdraw. He gets attacked at a small village called Landrecies. It's a completely confused action. The British are billeted there. Douglas Haig is actually there himself. And a German infantry regiment, which is also looking for billets, a place to stay for the night, has no idea Landrecies is occupied, walks into Landrecies in the middle of the night, sparking this very fierce, confused night action. They're as surprised to find the British there as the British are to find the Germans advancing on them. But in the midst of this, Douglas Haig, according to some sources, he panics. He's not been well during this campaign. He's stressed by this campaign. He's worried about being encircled. He's been ill. Initially was constipated, then he was given a dose of something, which apparently was very, very strong because he couldn't ride a horse after he'd taken it. He had to ride in a car. And combined with all this, suddenly his headquarters seems to be surrounded by gunfire and explosions. He gets bundled into a staff car. He races off and he sends to Smith Dorrien, I need help. I'm under heavy attack. In actual fact, it's only a skirmish, but it means Douglas Haig isn't going to be available for the battle that Smith Dorrien is about to fight, because Smith Dorrien's got problems of his own. At around about 11 p.m. on the 25th of August, Cavalry Commander Edmund the Bull Allenby arrives and tells Smith Dorrien that the cavalry are really worn out. They've been fighting rearguard actions all the way down the Roman road. The divisions got scattered, and he can't guarantee a cavalry screen. He urges Smith Dorrien, retreat under cover of darkness. But by now, there's a terrible thunderstorm over Lakato. It's pouring with rain. Smith Dorrien speaks to his infantry commanders and says, can we move under cover of darkness? They say, no way, we're scattered, we're exhausted. So what can Smith Dorrien do? If he moves off in the middle of the day, or in the morning, without a cavalry screen, there's every chance the Germans will catch him. But he can't move under cover of darkness. So he makes a fateful decision.
He is indeed. His decision, and it's one of the things I really love about Smith Dorrien. He's got an eye for the dramatic when it's required. He actually has a short conference with his senior officers, and he turns at the end of it, having weighed up his options, and says, very well, gentlemen, we'll fight. And that's exactly what he's going to do. He's going to deploy out, really using Lakato as his right flank, going to deploy into the fields about 4 miles off to his left. In fact, a little further if you include a random French cavalry unit that's careening around the battlefield. But his objective is to hold the Germans for as long as he can, ideally for a day. What in effect he ends up doing, in a boxing analogy, is a good solid counter jab. He punches the Germans, he gives them a pretty bloody nose and manages to stop their pretty headlong advance to try and catch the British rearguard, and he buys enough time for his men to reorganise, get themselves back on the road and continue the fight. Of course, Lakato is a much bigger story than this. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into all the detail, but if you want to know more, by all means check out our video on Lakato, which you can find on YouTube, which goes into real detail about the action. But the main thing is, Smith Dorrien manages to hold the Germans for at least a period of time. This is absolutely crucial as far as the story of the BEF and the early part of the retreat from Mons goes in 1914. Just a point on this, Spencer, in terms of the Battle of Mons particularly, is this in more general circles something which is actually considered the Battle of Mons?
It is, and this is something that's been lost a little bit in the subsequent history, because in 1914, and indeed for years afterwards, the Battle of Mons is seen as a 4-day battle, starting with Mons on the 23rd, Ordrenyi on the 24th, various rearguards and Landrecies on the 25th, and culminating with Lakato on the 26th. And I think that's a very helpful way to look at the Battle of Mons. Rather than just a single engagement on the 23rd, it's a series of engagements between the 23rd and the 24th, because Second Corps is in constant contact with German First Army from the 23rd until the 26th. And after the 26th, after the Battle of Lakato, bloody as it is, hard fought as it is, controversial in some ways as it is, the British suffer about 7,500 casualties. I think the official figure is 7,800, although that may be overestimated. So much heavier casualties than Mons. But crucially at Lakato, Second Corps breaks contact with German First Army. And German First Army will not re-establish contact with Second Corps again. The British fight their way clear. It's very hard fighting, it's very grueling fighting, but they've finally broken contact. And so it's useful to think of Mons as 4 days of continuous fighting, because if you're in Second Corps, that's exactly what it felt like. There was no respite during this period until after Lakato had broken contact with the pursuers.
That's right. And when you get to the end of this period, it's difficult to put an end point on a lot of retreats and battles of this nature. But in this case, I think we can. I think we can mention particularly the town of Saint-Quentin, in which a number of troops are making their way through. And at the very end of that column of troops retreating back from Mons, of course, is a cavalry rearguard. And there's one man in there who I think is definitely worth our time because of the fantastic and legendary episode that takes place in the town square at Saint-Quentin.
This is almost unbelievable. if we didn't have such great records of it happening, it might be dismissed as a propaganda invention, but it's absolutely true. So it's taking place at San Quentin on the 27th of August. Second Corps is passing through this, and many of the men are exhausted. They fought and, in many respects, won the Battle of Le Cateau, but there's been heavy casualties. A lot of these men are seriously sleep deprived. They've been marching and fighting for days in the heat. They're pretty exhausted, and it's grueling stuff. And in the later afternoon, entering the town of San Quentin come the Royal Warwickshires and the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. And their colonels, John Elkington of the Royal Warwickshires and Arthur Mannering of the Dublin Fusiliers, are confused, they're exhausted, they're isolated from the wider British army, and they're not sure what's happening. Mannering is a pretty unwell man. He probably should not have gone to France in 1914, and he's really suffering by now. And Elkington is just flat out exhausted. They arrived in San Quentin and they found the town in a state of pandemonium. There were some of the last British troops to enter the town. They'd been told there'd be trains that were going to take them south. That's what Elkington and Mannering were expecting, but they actually found there was nothing there. The trains had gone. And whilst they were there trying to plan their next move, they were harangued by the French mayor of San Quentin, who was terrified that the Germans were at the gates of San Quentin, and unless the British surrendered, he thought the Germans would destroy the town and massacre the civilians. And the mayor harangued Elkington and Mannering, and they were confused, exhausted, isolated. To their shame, they signed a document of surrender rather than risk the town being destroyed and blown to pieces by the Germans. And they accepted that their battalions, the Warwickshires and the Dublin Fusiliers, would lay down their weapons. And in some cases, they were disarmed by the French authorities. And there, the story may have ended. But there was a twist in the tale, because this man we keep teasing you, listeners, with was about to ride into the town square.
And his name is...
one and only Major Tom Bridges of the 4th Royal Dragoon Guards, who'd led his unit. He'd been involved in the first action between British and German cavalry on the 22nd. He'd taken part in the cavalry charge on the 24th of August at Ordrenys. He'd had his horse shot from under him then, and then he'd been run over by the machine gun section, as we've already mentioned. So he was concussed. He had a fractured cheekbone that was giving him a livid black eye, but he was still in the saddle on the 27th of August. He was the last cavalry rearguard for the army. He cantered into the town with dusty horsemen, and he discovered the situation where there were surrendered British troops sat around in a state of exhaustion. He spoke to them, he tried to cajole them. In his own memoirs, he said he was backed by some hefty henchmen, farriers and the like, but he couldn't intimidate these soldiers into marching again. They said the colonels had surrendered them and they weren't going to do anything else. So Bridges had to think really quickly. He needed to get some way to get these troops moving, and he came up with a pretty innovative solution.
He did indeed. So he looks around him, trying to figure out what he can do to motivate these exhausted, demoralised men. And he sees a toy shop, and he's actually going to go in there and he's going to buy a child's toy drum and a penny whistle. And along with another man, he's going to go up to the fountain in the centre of San Quentin Square, and he's going to march around it, playing Tipperary. And the sight of a major with a black eye and a broken cheekbone marching around this fountain seemed to have impressed the men, we could say. And men started to cheer, started to laugh, spirits started to rise, and before long, men were back on their feet. And in fact, those two battalions, the bulk of them, would return to the fight, would pick up their arms, continue the march. Only another 200 miles to go, we might add, but they were going to make it back, and they're going to become a part of the Great Retreat, and in fact play a big part in it later on. But it's the actions of men just like Bridges, and it's these fascinating moments that you sometimes get in history, Spencer, where you get an individual kind of injected into this scenario, and they manage to turn the tide, and it's really remarkable. In fact, Bridges carries on from here. In fact, Bridges carries on and comes back from here because he's forgotten something.
Yes, he has. He's managed to, in the confusion of his improvised musical performance, divest himself of a satchel and left it near the fountain. And in that satchel were some maps, which of course were extremely important. They got British troops marked on them. He realised it was still in there. So he cantered back in and he actually retrieved this satchel. And there were apparently German cavalry in the town. By now it was dark. They didn't really realise that he was a British cavalryman. They just heard hooves and saw a cavalryman moving around. So he manages to ride back in, retrieve his satchel and escape. Not only has he rallied the battalions, he's also retrieved some precious documents, and he'll go on to have an eventful war too. But perhaps that's something we could look at later on in this series.
Yeah, for sure. As is the story of the Great Retreat itself, as incredible as it is, leads us to the battles of the Aisne and the Marne, and some really, really heroic engagements. But this, in effect, this location here at Saint-Quentin could be said marks the end of the Battle of the Mons and the start of the Great Retreat. It's going to go on from here, of course.
I think that's a really fair way of putting it. If we say the Battle of Mons is a 4-day battle that begins with Mons, ends with Le Cateau, and then, although the Great Retreat could be said to begin at Mons, it's really, we could say it begins at Saint-Quentin on the 27th of August as the army continues to fall back, trying to get contact with the French, trying to reunite itself. It'll carry it hundreds of miles towards the gates of Paris. Absolutely grueling retreat in unimaginably hot conditions. It's a Edwardian summer of 1914, brutally hot, on roads crowded with refugees. There's some very intense rearguard actions, the famous rearguard action at Neary on the 1st of September, battle in the forest of Villers-Cotterêts involving the Irish Guards on the 1st of September, various other smaller actions on this retreat. But the main intense fighting, pitched battles period has ended with Le Cateau, and the British have managed to get themselves clear. Eventually, they'll retreat all the way down to the Marne, and it's there that they finally turn, because the French, under their commander Joseph Joffre, have organised reinforcements, have organised a brand new army at the gates of Paris, and realising the German Schlieffen Plan has overreached itself, it's expended its energy, it's vulnerable, the French launch a massive counterattack that becomes known as the Battle of the Marne. And after some doubt about whether they'll participate in it, because John French is not really convinced this is a good idea, eventually gets persuaded to do it, the British Expeditionary Force join that, and they've crossed the Marne heading south, but then on the 5th of September they stop, and on the 6th of September they cross the Marne heading north, and they will participate in the Battle of the Marne, advancing 60 miles all the way up to the Battle of the River Aisne, and shattering the German Schlieffen Plan in the process. Battle of the Marne is known as the Miracle on the Marne. After weeks of defeats and retreats, the British and the French counterattack. The Schlieffen Plan is shattered. The Germans cannot hold their position. And it's said that in the midst of the Battle of the Marne, the overall German commander, Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, he goes to the Kaiser himself and says, "Your Majesty, we have lost the war." Whether he actually said that, it may be apocryphal, but I believe he believed it, and von Moltke the Younger would have a nervous breakdown and be replaced not too long after the defeat at the Battle of the Marne. And I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say that completely reshapes the nature of the First World War.
Yeah, within weeks, months certainly, we're now getting fully established lines of trenches being built and held and constructed, covering some 400 miles from the English Channel down to Switzerland. We have the BEF being taken out of the line and moving up towards the infamous Ypres salient. And then we have, if you like, the birth of this kind of static period that's going to last for several years in the war. The British themselves are not going to go back to Mons. They're not going to see the town of Mons until the 11th of November 1918. But Mons itself has always had this fascinating place in the history of the First World War, particularly from a British perspective. And in fact, Spencer, as far as the story of Mons goes, it might be a fairly small action. It might have limited casualties. In fact, if you stack it up with the 20 deadliest battles of the First World War, it certainly doesn't appear in any of those lists. But in terms of its bigger importance, particularly on the home front, it really has a key place to play.
It really does. And this is, I think, an aspect of the Battle of Mons that has been almost totally forgotten in the historiography of the First World War. I know when I've given talks about the Battle of Mons, or I've occasionally appeared on YouTube feeds about this, quite a frequent comment is, well, who cares? Mons is a very small engagement compared to the Battle of the Frontiers the day before. You say it's far from the deadliest battle the British Army ever fight. Why do we place so much emphasis on this? And the reason is that it has a huge impact on the home front. Bear in mind, the army has gone to war in August 1914, but it's done so under conditions of a press blackout. Journalists are expressly forbidden from following the army forward into Belgium and up to Mons. And in fact, most of the press are actually hanging around in Paris, just fishing for a story, waiting for news. And think about how that feels in Britain, where you've got this news blackout. Britain is a huge news-reading society. Newspapers and magazines have enormous circulations. And these newspapers and magazines have got no news to print. They've only got rumour and murmurs, and nobody's sure, and everybody is craving information. Mons only gets reported in the vaguest of terms. There's rumour that there's been a fight at Mons, that there's been casualties. John French gives a dispatch, an official dispatch, in which he says the army's engaged, but there's no more information than that. And I think that's something to really consider. We think we live in a society now, in an age now, where we have total information. You can go on Twitter or any social media, you can go on Telegram, you can hit refresh, and you'll get a constant surge of stories, often nowadays accompanied by video clips, because anybody with a smartphone is a war reporter or a cameraman. But that's not the case in August 1914. The British population is absolutely starving for knowledge. He's desperate for knowledge. Rumours are swirling. There's gossip. There's all kinds of crazy stories. There's a crazy story starts circulating. A Russian army has landed in Scotland and is being transported south with snow on its boots, ready to be deployed alongside the British and land somewhere in Europe. And of course, it's all made up. But eventually a news story does break free, because a very intrepid reporter from the Times decides he's had enough. He's heard rumours that there's fighting further up the line. He's seen French casualty trains coming in. He knows there's bloody fighting elsewhere. He's going to leave Paris. He's actually going to get in a sports car. There seems to be a lot of sports cars driving around the battlefields in 1914. He jumps in a sports car and he heads north looking for a story. And according to some accounts, he's actually travelling with what every war reporter needs: some food and some champagne in his sports car. And what he's looking for is just somebody to interview. He wants to make contact with somebody and try and get the scoop, because he can't get the information way back in Paris. He needs to be in the front line. That journey takes him alongside Second Corps. Now, Second Corps is retreating on the 29th. It's fought, of course, the Battle of Le Cateau. It's broken clear, but at the same time, it's still on the retreat. And so he interviews troops who are retreating, who've been fighting very hard, who are a little bit confused or a little bit unsure of what's happening. They tell him a lurid tale: a retreating and broken army, battered with marching and full of grievously injured regiments. Those are actual quotes from a story that appears in the Sunday Times on the 30th of August under the headline, "Fiercest Fight in History, Heavy Losses of British Troops." And this is the first really on-the-ground report about what's happened. It's actually really reporting the Battle of Le Cateau, but it gets mingled in with the Battle of Mons, because remember, at this time, Mons is seen as a 4-day battle. And this is sensational news. Bear in mind, there's been no news from the front line up until this point. And then on the 30th, the Times, the biggest newspaper in Britain, breaks this story, and it's sensational. The British Army's in danger. It's suffered heavy casualties. It's fighting very hard, but it needs support. It needs reinforcements. Everything needs to be done. It causes a sensation. It actually leads to debates in Parliament. The War Office has to issue a counter statement, but that's completely ignored. By now, the cat is out of the bag. It's a sensational story. But if you think it demoralizes the British public, well, actually, the opposite is the case.
Sensational news, of course, often has sensational results, and that's exactly what happens back home in the UK. There is a huge surge to the colours, men enlisting left, right and centre. In fact, 175,000 men joined in the 6 days following that news breaking. This is a huge boost to a limited in size British Expeditionary Force, and in fact, in the weeks and months that follow, that surge is going to continue. Once again, with the news of the Aisne and the Marne, and hundreds of thousands of men are now going to be joining. And it's going to take us eventually, in fact, it's going to transform the British Expeditionary Force from what it had been in those early weeks of the war in 1914 into a completely different beast by 1915.
That's absolutely right. The old regular army that we started this podcast with, professionals, many of whom had fought in the wars of empire, old sweats, old soldiers, casualties that they suffered in 1914 and into the early part of 15 could not be replaced. You couldn't replace these highly trained regular soldiers. And their place would be taken by the volunteers who'd been inspired to join because of the news of the Battle of Mons. And these men would become known as Kitchener's Army because so many of them responded to that iconic recruitment poster in which Lord Kitchener finger is pointing out at you personally with Britain's "Your country needs you" or "Lord Kitchener needs you." There were many variations of this poster issued. And it was this poster that, of course, gave name to the Kitchener's army, or the New Army as it was known. And it was a new army, the like of which Britain had never had before. All volunteers, drawn from all classes and walks of life. It wasn't just like the pre-war regular army, which recruited overwhelmingly from the poorest in society. Now men who would never have considered military service decided to join in Britain's hour of need. But this army would face all kinds of trials and challenges in 1915 as Britain grappled with the problems of modern industrial-scale war. And many of those volunteers who joined in August and September, and indeed in the months that followed in 1914, would actually experience their baptism of fire just over a year later at the Battle of Loos, fought between September and October 1915. And that's going to be the subject of our next podcast episode.
It is. Very nice plug as we get to the end of today's episode. Absolutely. We are going to be looking at the Battle of Loos, and again, a 3-day battle traditionally, but in fact it could be argued to go on for significantly longer than that. So that's going to be our major focus, the battles of 1915, and the two divisions of the Kitchener Army who are going to make their way out there, the 21st and the 24th, and they're going to see action and sadly some horrific losses during that fight. But in order to round off, it's always interesting to reflect on these kind of battles. And Mons, as we've hopefully at least demonstrated, has a special place in the history of the British Army. Is it fair to say that it punches above its weight in terms of its significance?
I think it does. And something that I would argue is that within the wider context of this campaign, it is small. It's much smaller than the French forces that are engaged. But it finds itself almost by accident in the position where it can do the most damage to the Schlieffen Plan. It's right in front of German First Army, which, as we've established, is that main hammer of the Schlieffen Plan that's designed to rip into France. Completely by accident, the British Army finds itself opposing it. And yes, it has to retreat from this much larger force, but it fights all the way. It inflicts some stinging losses on the German army. And although there's been some arguments that the British overemphasize these losses, they might not be inflicting quite as much damage as they claim. What they do is they delay the German army. They cause trouble. They act as the sugar or the grit in the engine of the German war machine. And for a German war machine that is built around this very strictly timetabled Schlieffen Plan, these kind of disruptions have a cumulative effect. Combined with fierce French resistance and the incredible recuperation of the French army, its ability to recover from its early defeats is incredible. The tenacity and the resistance of the British army, it slowly but surely disrupts the Schlieffen Plan until the wheels come flying off completely just before the Battle of the Marne and the Germans are thrown back. And with that defeat, Germany loses its best chance to win the First World War, perhaps for the entire war, but certainly it wins its best chance to win the war in 1914. Instead, it's now going to be forced into a different kind of war that will ultimately lead to the creation of the Western Front. And so, as a force that plays such an important role in this campaign, the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force of 1914, is really worthy of remembrance. And its intense fighting and its grueling retreat from Mons and from Saint-Quentin, the longest fighting retreat in British Army history up to this point, and indeed only exceeded by the retreat through Burma in 1942, is worthy of remembrance. And I hope that those of you who've listened to this podcast who perhaps weren't so familiar with this campaign will be inspired to read a little bit more about this. I've written a number of books about the Mons campaign. If you're interested in the commanders of it, I'd recommend Stemming the Tide, edited by myself, a series of essays. Or if you're looking for a short account of it, I would recommend Mons to the Marne, The Great Retreat of 1914, which is just 96 pages, which covers this period in a lot more detail. But enough of my plugs, Dan.
Well, you can find those in the show notes, guys, if you'd like to know more. We'll put links down in the show notes below. But that rounds us off, I think, really nicely and brings us to the end of our second episode. Sincerely hope you've enjoyed it. It's always great fun to talk history and to share this kind of passion for the subject with you guys, and we're really looking forward to it and hope you will join us for the next one, where, as we said before, we'll be looking at 1915 and in particular the Battle of Loos. You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon. I can't remember the officer's name, that's why I keep avoiding it.
I can, yeah. So don't worry, I've got this.